Well, one of the headlines catching eyes today, Wells Fargo planning to cut thousands of jobs later this year, it says. The move may set a precedent for the banking industry that's been resisting mass layoffs. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Hannah Levitt. Hannah, put this into context for us. How many layoffs do we see from the likes of Wells Fargo every year?
Hey, Bonnie. So thanks for having me. Wells Fargo's headcount has stayed pretty steady over the past decade, even as peers have trimmed their headcount way down. For example, Bank of America was up close to 300,000 people in 2010, and they're now down to about 200,000. So Wells Fargo is steady at 260-some thousand heads, and people are expensive, and Wells Fargo's expenses have been a big issue for a long time.
Right. Now, how many will it have to cut, Hannah, and primarily where will those cuts come?
Yeah, so my understanding is that there haven't been any plans finalized yet, but that the cuts will be broad-based. I mean, they're looking at cuts that could be in the tens of thousands. So it's not going to be, from one specific area as much as it'll be just across the whole firm.
Surely that also entails the closure of branches, perhaps the closure of even smaller headquarters around the country.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I think as we've seen in the past few months, the world is changing in terms of how people use space generally. So that'll definitely be something to keep an eye out for.
When do we expect to hear more about this? We should mention that Wells had done, pretty okay in the last earnings report.
Yeah, so Wells is reporting their next quarter earnings next week. So we should get an eye into how bad things are, both for them and then across the industry. And last quarter they set aside a huge amount for loan losses, and this quarter is expected to be even worse on that front. So we'll get into an eye into just how bad things are next week, and then throughout, in the coming weeks and months, we'll get more of an idea of how many job cuts there will be and where they'll come from.
Now, I do want to point out that Wells Fargo doesn't have a comment on this right now, but Hannah, why are Wells Fargo's compensation costs higher than its peers?
Yeah, so Wells Fargo has really kept their headcount steady in recent years as peers have been working to trim their headcounts down. And, Wells has had a lot of issues in recent years, right? They had the fake account scandal that started in 2016, and then a whole set of just follow-on issues that have really pushed their expenses through the roof on the headcount matter, but also just generally speaking with fines and legal costs and things like that. So now they have a new CEO who took over in October, and he's been doing a review of, the entire firm, and he's going to be coming out with his conclusions at the end of this year was the latest guidance on that.
Will this serve as a precedent to other banks, particularly consumer-facing banks, perhaps, to give them sort of a little cushion if they do want to actually make some headcount reduction themselves, but don't want to look bad during a pandemic?
Yeah, it definitely could. So a lot of the big banks have been holding off on job cuts through the pandemic, but as we're seeing with Wells Fargo, that can't last forever. And especially with the Federal Reserve stress test that came out, and it set a formula for how much banks can pay out in their dividends. So Wells Fargo was immediately impacted by that. But if or when other firms are, then certainly I think this is something that they'll look to.